Okay. Bam! What's up, everyone? It's Prop Anon coming at you with another installment of Jib Jab Hour. Today, I have a very special guest who has, graced us with his presence and will speak with us today a little bit about a often misunderstood and very little known topic, but one that is extremely important for people to know about, and that is what has been known as the Troubles in the north of Ireland, a very tragic time that happened between around 1966 to around 1998, when this thing called the Good Friday Agreements were signed. Mr. Moloney is my guest. Ed Moloney is an award-winning Irish journalist, best known for his coverage of the Troubles in the north of Ireland. Mr. Moloney was a reporter covering the Troubles on the ground for such periodicals as Hibernia, McGill, the Irish Times, and the Sunday Tribune. He's written 3 books: Paisley, From Demagogue to Democrat, with a question mark at the end, because was Ian Paisley ever a Democrat? The Secret History of the IRA, and his 3rd book, Moloney's 3rd book, Voices from the Grave, which was also turned into an award-winning documentary of the same name. These days, besides doing interviews with folks like myself, Mr. Moloney posts his newer articles on his website, The Broken Elbow, which I recommend to all viewers of this interview to check out. When it comes to the dogged path of journalism, Mr. Moloney has earned his stripes as a sleuth for truth. He has risked his life and reputation over the course of his career in order to provide some reliable information during the Troubles, when so much was and still remains so cloaked in uneasy mystery. Mr. Moloney's long career chronicled the Troubles is worthy of a multi-hour long interview series, but I will spare him of that today, as we will dig into some specific things over the course of about 45 minutes. So, I found so much when it comes to the Troubles in Irish history that one needs to constantly unpack and contextualize present circumstances through the long view of history. In other words, one does not really get a full understanding of the Troubles if one doesn't know about the long history of imperialistic invasion of Ireland by the British, dating back to at least the 1500s. So, Mr. Moloney, thank you for joining me today. And just to get the wheels turning, could you just briefly describe, as difficult as that is, what the Troubles were?
Well, funnily enough, America and what became the Troubles in Northern Ireland have a very, very close and strong link. At the same time that the English government under the Stuart monarchy was beginning to explore the idea of setting up colonies in what became the United States, places like Virginia, they were also having to decide what to do about what they described or what they thought of as the Irish problem, which was much closer to them. And the problem with the Irish problem was that it was there on the western flank of England. It was sympathetic to other European nations like France and Spain, who were all Catholic. Ireland itself was Catholic. England was by that stage, a solidly Protestant monarchy. And Ireland was regarded as a possible source of trouble. Maybe a place where foreign powers like France and Spain would use as a jumping off board to get into England, and then to go down to London and capture the capital city and overthrow the monarchy. Because you have to remember, at the closest point between Ireland and, if you want to call it, the British mainland, is in the north of Ireland. There's a gap of something like 10 or 15 miles, that's all. I mean, an army would be able to cross, having landed, let's say, further down in the south or the west of Ireland and made its way up to the north, would be able to cross over in 2 or 3 hours and then the route would then be down to London, and who knows what could happen after that. So it was extraordinarily important for the English government to pacify Ireland, or to control it in some way, to make sure that it wasn't this sort of base, was not going to be a threat to them. And this was happening at the same time as England was setting up colonies in what became the United States, America. And they decided that the best way to solve the problem in Ireland was to do what they were doing in America, which was to export its people and set up plantations there, just like they did in Virginia. Then they did exactly the same in Ireland. They sent over people from areas in England and Scotland that they knew would be loyal to them. In other words, these were Protestants, some of them Presbyterians, some of them Anglicans. Send over to Ireland, give them land that belonged to the native Irish, and build up a population that would be loyal and could be depended upon to rise up and defend England if there was that type of invasion, which the English always feared from Spain or France, one that would, let's say, start in the west of Ireland and Galway area, or down in Cork, and then make its way up to what is now Larne and cross over. Well, if they had this plantation there, this plantation of people, then they could at least hold that invasion long enough to mobilize against it. And funnily enough, one of the very first boats that was commandeered to send over people from England and Scotland to begin the plantation in Northern Ireland, or what became Northern Ireland, was diverted to Virginia. And that's how the plantation in Virginia started. So the links between America, the early history of America and Ireland are they overlap, and they're uncannily close in many ways. But having done that, you then had a situation in which you had an island which was essentially divided between a population that was loyal through religion to the English crown, and a population that was hostile through religion, Catholic religion in their case, to the English crown. And you have the basis there of a thrust for independence, resentment at being occupied, and periodic attempts to overthrow English rule, which started in the 17th century, and again in the 18th century, most notably with the United Irishmen. Again in the middle of the 19th century, this time with American help, the Fenians. Again in 1916, 1921. Ireland was then partitioned. The solution to the problem, as far as the English was concerned, and they more or less got their way, was to divide Ireland into two parts. One where you would have the native Irish who would be able to control their own areas, but the north would remain under British control. And you therefore would have still that buffer against any mischief making in the direction of England. That settlement, that solution in quote marks, lasted until the latter part of the 1960s, when you had a rising new burgeoning Catholic young population, the product of the welfare state that had been created in England, and which obviously was applied elsewhere after the war, after the Second World War. The welfare state, free education, university education. People who were before that kept in poverty now had a chance of earning a decent living, and they were living in a society which they were not allowed, just like the blacks in America were not allowed to develop in the way that they wanted, to express themselves and to become what they wanted to become. And they were deprived of political rights, for example, the right to vote in many cases, the right to have decent housing, right to fair employment, no discrimination. So similar sort of, demands, and I wouldn't want to make the comparisons, all that closely to the black experience in America, which was much, much worse than anything that happened in Ireland. But they have similar points of similarity. So that's the seed of the Troubles, essentially.
Thank you for that. And of course, there are so many other things in that history that deserve further unpacking and explanation. which again, you do that throughout your work. Again, I encourage listeners to check out Mr. Moloney's work. But that very quick recapitulation of Irish history into the Troubles, in speaking about your book, The Secret History of the IRA, you chose to open, which is about the Troubles, right? And you chose to open the book with a harrowing tale about a shipment of weapons that the IRA received from Libya, but that was intercepted and busted by the authorities in October 1987, a ship called the Exxon. Now, I'm curious, what I really like about that story, how you open the book, is that it encapsulates so many tropes, if you will, that repeated throughout the Troubles and Irish history, transatlantic gun running, clandestine movements, terrorism, intelligence wars. But you wrote, could you briefly describe that, well, could you tell me, well, why did you choose that particular story to open this chronological tale of the Troubles with?
Well, first of all, because no one knew until I wrote about it that there had been an informer at work in relation to that shipment, right? To sort of briefly tell the story of the relationship between Libya and the IRA, Gaddafi came to power in Libya more or less at the same time as the provost came into existence in the autumn of 1969. And he was a Nasserite. He followed the gospel of Arab nationalism, which had been established by Nasser in Egypt. And he was, and Libya was a country which had been occupied by foreign powers from the Roman Empire onwards, in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And then after the First World War by the British, and then after the Second World War, it was occupied again before the Second World War by the Italians, by Mussolini. After the Second World War, there wasn't an actual occupation, but the three victorious powers, the main powers in the fighting the war against the Nazis, established areas of influence in Libya. The Americans had the area around Tripoli. They had a huge base there, Wheeler's base, which they used to keep an eye on the Soviet southern flank. The British had the eastern part around Benghazi, and the French had the southern part of Libya down by Chad, which was one of their important and wealthy colonies. So after the Second World War, they were occupied until the Gaddafi revolution, essentially in all but name by Britain, America, and France. And there was a king who was a king a ruler in name only, called Idris. He was overthrown by Gaddafi, who was inspired, as I said, by the Nasserite revolution in Egypt. And automatically his sympathies were to the IRA, and he reached out to them, and they reached back, and that began a very long relationship. It lasted from 1969 all the way through to almost to Gaddafi's overthrow. But this particular point that we're talking about was one of the high points. And it all happened as a direct result of the Thatcher and Reagan assault against Gaddafi. You might remember there was an attempt to kill Gaddafi with a US bombing mission, which took off from British airfields. And that infuriated Gaddafi and inspired him to really step up his assistance to the IRA. And they agreed with the IRA to send over as much weaponry as they could to make life of Thatcher as difficult and as awkward as possible, as an act of revenge for attacking Gaddafi. And you've got to remember, of course, that one of his adopted children was killed in the raid that Reagan launched against Tripoli. So he had a personal reason for doing this. And a number of those shipments had got through. There had been small shipments at first to see if they could do it, see if they could escape the attentions of the intelligence agencies, because that's an area of the world that's under intense surveillance by the British, by the Americans, and by the Israelis. So the chances of getting even a small shipload of arms through would be pretty slim. But they managed to get 4 shiploads of weapons, mostly in small, sort of like boats that were a wee bit smaller, a wee bit smaller than a freight ship, but larger than a trawler, if you like. And there were significant amounts of weaponry came in, the largest amounts of weaponry the IRA had been able to smuggle in one go. But the final shipment on the Claudio was going to be the big one. This was going to be all the heavy weaponry that the IRA had never really been able to get its hands on. SAM-7 missiles, heavy machine guns, and stuff like that. I mean, really quite sophisticated material. And this was going to be used for the basis of a major offensive, which they modeled it on the Vietnamese offensive against the American government in, when was it, 1969?
Yeah, the Tet Offensive.
Tet Offensive. Yeah. And they called it the Tet Offensive, with the IRA's Tet Offensive. So it's very important for them that the weaponry got through. Now, up until I did my research and wrote the book, all we knew about this shipment was that it seemed to have been intercepted entirely by accident. That this was an old freighter that they were using. It wasn't, in the best of shape. And off the coast of France, the propeller stopped working, right? So it stalled. And the French seemingly, this is the story that we were told, sent out customs to investigate. And lo and behold, what did they find? But they discovered that this was a boat full of arms. And so it seemed that by bad luck, the IRA expedition had failed for that reason, for no other reason. Well, I was able to show that actually, no, there was an informer on the job, someone on the IRA side. And who that informer was has been a matter of great speculation. And it set the scene, if you like, for a story which was also about internal divisions inside the IRA over which direction they were taking. And there were 2 camps. There was the militarist camp, which wanted to continue the war, and there was the camp led by Adams and McGuinness, which was moving very much in a political direction, wanted to end the war, come to some sort of political arrangement and deal and settlement with the British and the Irish governments, and change their strategy entirely to one of politics, the electoral politics mostly. And there are all sorts of suggestions that the informer came from that side of the IRA, if you like, that the information was passed on to the British in some way by that side of the debate inside the IRA. So I thought it was very, very important to establish, first of all, that the accident was not lost by chance or by mischance or by accident or by mechanical failure or anything like that, but it had been lost because there'd been a traitor inside the IRA who had told the authorities about the British authorities about what was happening, and that set the scene for what became a very, very complex and still debated story about how the IRA ended its war, how the peace process in Ireland happened, and what the truth was. So that's why I began the book with that. First of all, it was a story no one had heard before. Secondly, it was of huge importance in framing the rest of the story, which was about the end of the IRA's campaign.
Yeah, it was a great beginning. And let's talk about that a little bit. This revelation and the continued revelations of the fact that the IRA had been, especially towards the end, completely saturated with informers and agents of different organizations, from MI5 to Special Branch to the Irish police, even the FBI. I mean, there were even some East Germans who one time wanted to infiltrate the IRA to get information and stuff like that. Like entering this clandestine world, whereby 1988, you mentioned one time that was it 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 IRA members were agents of some kind towards the end?
Well, that's an estimate that I've seen. But can I just say one thing, by the way? I noticed you held up the book there. That is
Yeah.
the very first edition.
Yes.
There's a second edition. There's a second edition of the book,
Okay.
which includes stuff that I was not able, for all sorts of source reasons, to include in that edition. So if people want to like a fuller story, and also about the excellent, because there was stuff about the excellent I couldn't use in the first edition, which I did in the second edition. Okay.
Mhm.
They should look for the second edition rather than the first edition. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, what was your question again? What was
Well,
your question again?
Yeah, it was basically so let's look at this notion of the informers then within the IRA, right? And
Yeah.
as you mentioned about the Exxon story, no one ever really found out exactly who that particular informer was, but they had inclinations that perhaps it was coming from Northern Command, right? Somewhere in Northern Command.
Possibly higher than that. Who
Wow.
knows? I mean, the details about the Exxon and the Libyan adventure were supposed to be, at the very, very top of the IRA. This was an operation that was being run primarily by the Army Council, which is the ruling body, 7 men and a few other people who are seconded to the Army Council. Maybe 9 people altogether, mostly men. But the IRA being the IRA, being very gossipy and what have you, a lot of people knew something was happening at the same time. But you've got to remember, this was a war that had been going on for an awful long time by that stage. This was 1987. The war was already like nearly 20 years old by that stage. Well, you run an organization like that for 20 years. You're hang on a second. Let me just kill this.
No problem.
Okay. You're bound to have an informer problem, and to give an example of how bad it was, at quite an early stage in the IRA's development, after the first couple of years of hang on, sorry about this.
No problem.
There we are. After the first couple of years or so of the IRA's campaign, it was really, it really wasn't. They thought the war was only going to last 2 or 3 years, and they would either win or they would lose. But then they ended up having to fight this very, very long war. And once they realized that, people particularly like Jerry Adams realized, you needed to have a mechanism inside the IRA to counter efforts by the British to infiltrate you, right, through either MI5, which is the sort of equivalent of the FBI in Britain, except it's more secret, or the police special branch. I don't know if there's an equivalent to that in the United States. This is the police force in Britain and also in Ireland, which is entirely political and mostly is dealing with what they regard as subversives and what have you. And they're almost like a separate police force, and like a secret police, if you like. Okay, so these people were hell bent on infiltrating you and causing you as much damage as possible. And so they set up a unit inside the IRA to monitor the informer problem, to seek out informers, to catch them and kill them, and counter as much as they could the counterintelligence efforts of the British and the Irish governments. And the guy who eventually became head of the anti-informer unit, a guy called Freddie Scappaticci, and he's got an Italian name because a lot of Italians came over to Ireland in the latter part of the 19th century. And quite a few of them settled in Belfast, and of course they were Catholics, and they identified with the local Catholic population. And Freddie Scappaticci was a member of a family which was had quite a long reputation of being involved in the IRA, and he was obviously an IRA activist himself. But he ended up being a more or less the head of this anti-informer unit. But he was also a spy for the British. Well, if you have someone at that level of your organization who's working for the other side, he knows all your secrets. He knows everyone who's in the IRA, because as the head of the anti-informer unit, if something happened that shouldn't have happened, he would be sent along with his minions to investigate it, and they would know who was involved in this area or that area, what they did, who was in charge of this, and who was in charge of that. They would have a complete picture of the IRA from a character like that, and they would know, for example, that they might know once they started recruiting people, they would know that when certain operations were going to happen, they would catch the people and maybe turn them, send them back into the IRA informers. So it was a very, very long war like that, which was regarded by people who dreamt up the concept of a long war as this was the way that they were going to win the war by outlasting the British, was actually a point of weakness for them, right? Because it enabled the British to infiltrate them. So these estimates, 1 in 4 or whatever it was of the organization being infiltrated and being members of the country or working for British intelligence, I think are entirely credible because of that. So the accent was caught. Was that because so many people knew about it, or was it because there was a traitor at an even higher level, someone like the Army Council level? That's the sort of question that's raised as a result of the accent. It's a very dark question, and it's going to be debated for a very, very long time. That's the importance of that episode.
And it's still a question that's unresolved. 23 years after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, it's still a dark cloud that looms over, Irish republicanism and the quote unquote the north of Ireland in general. A lot of progress has been made since 1998, but as anyone who follows what has gone on, it's still very tense and what do they call it? A powder keg of friction. And of course, the whole Brexit debacle, unleashed old prejudices in the British press and et cetera, which is really sad to see. But you mentioned there about the creation of, what I guess became known as the Nutter Squad. Yeah, Scappaticci and his crew. That coming out of being birthed in Longkesh prison when Jerry Adams and Brendan Hughes and Ivor Bell and a few other fellas there created the plan to rescue the IRA, which, like you also then said in the book, was also a plan perhaps as a way for Jerry Adams to take over the movement, right? Which I guess in and of itself, well, that's a whole other thing to unpack. And you've covered Jerry Adams's career very well. But just to give a ground to that plan, that's where they created the active service unit plan, which consisted of, as you wrote, small secret 3 or 4 men cells that the operators, the on the ground people didn't really know about other cells, which was different than the past, which was full of large battalions and flying companies and things, flying columns and stuff like that. And Adams specifically created this plan of basically a top-down sort of panopticon knowledge, like a pyramid, where every cell they would know about what they were doing. They get information from the top, but they wouldn't know about what other stuff's happening outside. Yet those on the Army Council would know everything. And then some, like the squad, the Nutter Squad, were able to, that ASU was able to move freely through all the other ASUs and get all the information they wanted. Yeah. Is that correct? Is that a good way to
yeah, except in practice it didn't quite work out like that, because although the theory was good that you have these secret cells and no one else would know who was in the cell except the cell members and so on and so forth, Belfast is a very small town, really, and the north of Ireland is a very small place. And the number of people who are actually involved in the IRA is not great in number. It's never more than 200 or 300 at the most. Really, it'd be like they were the sort of the peak of the iceberg, and the rest of the iceberg was under the water, admittedly. But everyone knew who was in the IRA in these areas. So even if you set up something that's supposed to be super secret, it wouldn't be super secret for very long. And indeed, that was one of the problems. It sounded great in theory, but in practice, it didn't really work out very well.
Right. So it was just too easy to penetrate then with the top-down structure like that.
Yeah, at the same time, though, it took a long time for the British to get on top of the IRA, and this is really quite remarkable because it's such a small place, really, the population is very small, the geographical area is very small, and yet it took the British so long to get a real handle on it, and that's quite remarkable, really, when you think about it.
Right on. So swerving back over to Gaddafi for a moment, since his death, obviously more has come out about how much wheeling and dealing this guy did on the international level, right? Even though he wanted to wage war and kill Thatcher and take down the British Empire, only a few years after him giving all these weapons to the IRA, he made nice with the British in the early to mid 90s. And then part of his deal with the British was he handed over all the information that he got from the IRA to the British.
Mm-hmm.
You think that played any part in helping the British eventually kind of basically?
Well, you got to, but at the same time as Gaddafi was playing nice to the British, so was the IRA. I mean, Blair was jetting over to Tripoli to sit in Gaddafi's tent and sip coffee, and the next week he'd be hosting Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness in Downing Street. So what's the difference? Yeah, sure. I mean, the Libyans, obviously they told the British a lot of what they'd done. They gave them a full manifest of the arms that they had sent over, right? So the British knew when it came to decommissioning whether the IRA had given everything up or not, which is very important for them. Okay, the IRA, one of the conditions that the Libyans imposed at the start of the Exxon adventure or chapter, if you want to call it, was that all of those involved, a small number of people who were involved in going over to Libya and choosing the weaponry and making the logistical arrangements with the Libyans, they had to hand over all their IDs and passports, what have you, to the Libyans, who obviously photocopied them. So they had a full record of who the IRA people involved in that particular part of the relationship, who they were, and they handed all that information over to the British as well. But I'm sure that was not something that was a terrible, great secret for the British by that stage, because they, as I say, they clearly had very good information about the Libyan adventure. There were so many instances of people from the Army Council, Martin McGuinness in particular, meeting other IRA leaders at a much lower level, but still leaders in their own areas, and telling them about this plan to bring all the weapons over. And of course, those people went home and they gossiped, and they talked. And I remember hearing about this is long before the peace process, and long before I would even dream about writing a book like The Secret History of the IRA, hearing about there was this big plan for a Tet offensive and stuff like that, and it never happened, and we never worked out why it didn't happen, or why it didn't happen. We don't know. It might have been this, might have been that. But enough was known about this highly secret thing at a lower level. It would have been remarkable for the British not to have known about it. They certainly did know about it.
Gotcha. And one thing I always wonder about the Troubles, it was a conflict that occurred during the Cold War, right? And like you said, early on in the Troubles, 1972, the IRA thought that it would be a 2 or 3 year war, which is pretty much what the War of Independence was. It was a 2-year war, 1919, 1921. I just kind of wonder about what sort of overlying effect that this Cold War mentality that has basically this clandestine approach to everything that has happened since World War II, what sort of effect that had on the Troubles,
And
so
what do you
in other
mean now?
well, so for instance, where was the CIA during all this stuff? The FBI in America, they were always supposedly they were monitoring the Irish Republicans even before further back than the late 70s, right? The Irish Republicans have been monitored in America since the 1940s. I have notes from J. Edgar Hoover, sending word to British intelligence about monitoring Irish Republicans in America since the 40s. We know that the feds have been on the case. But where has the CIA been during all of this stuff? I wonder.
Where's Guy who?
The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. What were they doing during this whole time?
Well, who knows? I mean, that's part of the story we don't know about, clearly. But I would imagine that since the IRA was involved in with Gaddafi and also with other Arab groups, other Palestinian groups, for example, and they weren't the only Irish group that was involved in the Middle East. The INLA was also involved with sections of the Palestinian resistance to Israel. That they were bound to have had an interest in there, but that has not yet emerged. I imagine one day it may emerge. But I guess even so, it wouldn't have been like anywhere near the top of the CIA's agenda in the Middle East at all. It would have been, we'll keep an eye on this and let the Brits do what we, than anything else. Maybe there are instances where they actually were operationally involved, but it hasn't yet emerged.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And so we're about 40 minutes in. Ed, you have time for a couple more questions?
Surely, go ahead.
Okay. So, well, it's two sort of things. Well, one thing that I really find, it's one of the kind of tragedies of Irish history is a struggle to tell the story to the next generation. When luckily now there are history books, one can learn about Irish history, that it's the same thing. In comes the British imperialism and the resistance against it for hundreds of years. That's the story, for the most part. Yet, this and the type of obviously brutality that was directed at the Irish for hundreds of years, part of it always to control people is you strip them of their language, you strip them of their culture, you strip them of their history, and then you try to reconstruct them. And that's been the constant struggle of regaining the knowledge of history, right? And in the War of Independence, after the War of Independence, there were a number of Irish writers or people who interviewed the soldiers who fought. This is extremely important to be done for the Troubles. And as you know firsthand, how much resistance there is towards telling this story. Why is that? Why is there still, it's to the point where even, older Irish Republicans won't even tell the younger generation details because they don't want to get in trouble still, So what is the struggle to just tell Irish history, this brand of Irish history?
Well, as you say, there are people opposed to that, right? There are the authorities, as you know from the Boston College story, right, move against people who tell their stories and try to prosecute them. But they're not the only ones who are, resisting this idea of truth telling and what have you. The IRA leadership itself, is adamantly opposed to people doing this sort of stuff. Jerry Adams has created an entire fiction about his own life. He's never been in the IRA. that's his version of events. But somehow he managed to be this person of extraordinary influence. The truth is, of course, he was near or at the top of the IRA for most of the time that he was involved, from the 1968, 69 onwards. So there's a disapproval there. Disapproval from the point of view that if you turn a blind eye to people telling their own stories, well, how can you control that? Because goodness knows where it will end up. There might be bits and pieces of stories that you would rather were never told. And I'm given one example tonight, which is the whole story about the Exxon, the whole story about informers and stuff like that. One of the dark theories about the informers is that it actually suited people in the leadership in the IRA to have informers like that. Okay, because if you wanted to move the IRA in a more political, non-military direction, then it's served your interest to undermine the military campaign, for example, right? These are very dangerous thoughts to have if you're in an organization like that. And so they are squashed. They are prevented from telling their stories and disapproved of, if they do, and get into all sorts of trouble if they do. I mean, one of the great things that we were worried about doing the Boston College thing was that wasn't so much that the British would find out about it, it was that the provost would find out about it, And if the provost found out what we were doing, then they would hunt these people out and kill them, The British might try to put them in jail, but the provost would kill them. That was the problem, Funnily enough, the loyalists didn't have that problem at all. They didn't really care that much. But on the Republican side, which led me to believe actually that the Provo leadership had much more to hide in terms of their own history and their own doings than the loyalists had, which I think is true.
So lastly, where are we at today? Where is what's the vibe of Irish republicanism in Ireland, America, England today? What do you foresee? What do you foresee?
Well, I don't know. We're at one of these points where we don't know. We don't know where it's going to. Some of the stuff I read seems to me to be hopelessly optimistic. Maybe there is reason for optimism in terms of there's going to be a great move for a united Ireland. I honestly don't see it myself. Because I know the place, I know the unionist population quite well, and just because of Brexit, I don't think they're going to change their minds all that much, because the differences are much more fundamental than that. They go back to that plantation that we talked about at the very start of this. The fear of on the Protestant side, fear of being basically exterminated, if you like, politically or even in a human sense, and on the other side you have the feeling of nationalists that they will never ever get a square deal whenever the unionists are in power. And so there'll be a constant fight and constant battle between them. So I don't know. We're on one of those points in history where we can't tell really with much clarity what's going to happen, but we never were at any point like that in the last 30 years, really. So there's no difference in that, but what I can say is with absolute certainty is that the quality of journalism, quality of coverage of what's going on there has deteriorated to an astonishingly bad degree, but I'm out of it now, so I can't really complain.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Like many things with the Troubles, it's a fairly troubling foresight, but there's still glimmers of hope, And so I just want to thank you very much, Mr. Moloney. I hope,
no problem.
Perhaps maybe we can do some future interviews and dig into the book.
Sure.
But could I speak to you for a second after the recording right here? Okay.
Sure.
So I'll just stop recording it. And
okay. All right.